In this session, we're going to dive into the genesis of Islam. And as we do, we're going to be striving to get as close to the truth as we possibly can, asking the fundamental question, what is the real story behind how Islam began? And more importantly, why does it matter? Now, I believe that understanding this could provide us with a crucial key. A key that might inform how we interpret the unfolding of Bible prophecy. After all, the Islamic people have a future, a destiny, and a place in the larger prophetic narrative. Now, the story we've all heard, the one we're most familiar with, is what's called the Standard Islamic Narrative. It's the account of a man called Muhammad who went on a mountain in Mecca, received the divine oracles of God from the angel Gabriel, which were then later compiled into what we now know today as the Quran. Now, this is the legend Islam have taught the West. This is the narrative they want us to believe. But here's where things get really interesting. To my absolute astonishment, through the lens of scholarly research, linguistic analysis, and compelling archaeological findings, there's an entirely different school of thought. One that argues we should reconsider Islam's origins and perhaps entertain a very different origin story. So I think as Bible students, as well prophetic Bible students, we have to take this really seriously. We have to weigh these two stories, balance them, and ask ourselves which one aligns more closely with the divine narrative. This is the challenge before us, to critically assess the standard Islamic narrative and consider what may really have triggered the birth of Islam. And could this hold a key to unlocking some of the mysteries of Bible prophecy? That's the journey we're embarking on, seeking truth, challenging narratives, and ultimately gaining a deeper understanding of how this all fits together in the grand prophetic puzzle.
We're going to begin at the death of Muhammad in 632. Now, according to Islamic tradition, everything in this religion should be fully formed in its correct place, in its correct location by 632 AD. In other words, everything in Islam should be in its right place by that particular point. Now, when we come to a man so significant as Muhammad, who led a campaign that stood the test of time, we need some sort of biography of this man. We need an eyewitness statement. I mean, eyewitness statements came of Jesus of Nazareth in his lifetime. So when might you think the first ever biography written of Muhammad was placed? How many years do you think it's going to be after his death? Well, there's one in 765. I mean, we're talking now 133 years after the death of Muhammad, we have the first biography written about him. In fact, what's so awkward about this, the original manuscript, we don't know where it is. In fact, we don't even know if Ibn Hisham even existed. So we've got to go further in time to this man called Ibn Hisham, 200 years after. Brothers and sisters, this is 200 years too late. I mean, the Islamic tradition says this was passed on by oral tradition. But come on, brothers and sisters. We know human nature. It tends to be rather biased and prone to error. That's ubiquitous. This is very unreliable. Well, what about the sayings of Muhammad, the actual quotations, the statements? These are known as the hadith. Well, they were written 238 years later. And if they're written 230 years later, these are all going to be redacted back, aren't they? Well, what about the commentaries of Muhammad, the Tasfir, the expositions of this man? We're now into the 10th century, 923. This is all, brothers and sisters, far too late. Now, what we begin to realize as we look at the screen, all of the biographies, all of the statements are all clustered together within a period of a few years. This era is known as the Abbasid period of Islam. And we are introduced to the man Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, 84 years into that period, hundreds of years after his supposed death. Now, it gets even more strange because when we look at those men, the key figures who wrote about the man Muhammad, none of them lived near Mecca. In fact, some of them lived thousands of miles from Mecca. And if we go into a little bit more detail and we look at historical maps of ancient times, Mecca doesn't exist. It's not there in the 2nd century. It's not there in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th century. It's not there. In fact, the first time we read of the word Mecca is in 741, and the maps start introducing the place Mecca in 900 AD. And if Mecca is such an important part of the Islamic tradition, well, we have to ask the question, why is it only mentioned once in the Quran? Can you imagine if Jerusalem was just mentioned once? Mecca, only once. Well, what about the coins? The coins are important because they're going to maintain the identity, the civilization, the religion, and the ruler of the caliph at that time. And when you look at the data of the coins, none of them are minted in Mecca. In fact, all the coins are in Israel or in Iran, Iraq, in the Fertile Crescent. None are coined or minted in Mecca. So we ask the question, why, brothers and sisters? I've never been to Mecca. Well, I've seen images of it. It's a desert. You imagine what it would have been like in the 7th century? There's a desert, brothers and sisters, there's no water. And if there's no water, there's no food. If there's no food, there's no people. If there's no people, there's no civilization. If there's no civilization, then frankly, there's no history in Mecca. I'm just presenting you the research that's there. So let's go deeper into the coins itself. We're going to look at the first ever coins of Islam. This is the Rashidun period. These are the 4 caliphs who came after Muhammad. And look, I'm going to propose the question to you. Do you notice anything strange on the first coins of Islam? It's an open question. Crosses. We have Christian iconography on an Islamic coin. It's rather strange, isn't it? Well, let's go a little bit forward in time. Remember, Islam should be fully established by 661. Well, let's go to that time period. We're now in the Umayyad period, and what a surprise, brothers and sisters. We have Christian iconography. And you'll notice on the far right, we have a fish. And I believe the fish is the very icon of Christianity. Why would a Muslim caliph have Christian icons on a Muslim coin? They denounce Christianity. It tells us in the Quran, Surah 4, verse 157. It sounds strange saying that. Jesus, it says, did not die on the cross. And yet we have the cross on an Islamic coin in the 7th century. Something, brothers and sisters, doesn't quite seem right. And well, you'll notice on the coin, there is a word. Unfortunately, it might be quite blurred to you, but it's an Arabic word. It's this. It's the word Mahmed. MHMD. And there's no vowels during the 7th century. They came a little bit later. So one would presume that this word was going to be the base form of what would then become Muhammad. And we're absolutely right. The name Muhammad means the praised one, the chosen one, the anointed one. It's not a name. It's a title. And this name and title doesn't begin in the 7th century. This name, this title goes back to the 10th century BC. You know what? It's in our Bibles. You know this one, Song 5, verse 6. Many of our brethren say this in their prayers. His mouth is most sweet. Yea, he's altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend. I've highlighted that word lovely. The phrase the lovely one. And you'll never have a guess what that word is in Hebrew. It's the word Mahmed. And it's the same in the Aramaic as it is in the Hebrew. And in fact, I'm told that the participle of Mahmed in the Hebrew is highly related to the idea of the chosen one, the begotten one. It's a title here given to the king, the anointed. It's a title for the Messiah. And here it's used of Solomon, the king, the son of David. But I believe it was Jesus in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 42 who proclaimed that, behold, the greater than Solomon is here. And he just so happens to use that phrase with a very special queen. Behold, the greater than Solomon is here, he says. And he uses that in reference of a queen from the south, who we can identify as the Queen of Sheba. Brothers and sisters, where's Sheba today? I believe that's Arabia. And if we were to go to the episode of 2 Chronicles 9 and see Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, it explicitly tells us that the kings of Arabia offered their gifts at the feet of the lovely one, the Mahmed, the son of David, the king of Israel. So when we look at the coin, and we look at the crosses, and we look at the title, who's on the coin? Who's this coin about? This is Jesus, brothers and sisters. The altogether lovely one. It's awkward and ironic, isn't it, that many of us have Muslim colleagues, Muslim friends. How many of them are called Muhammad? Who do you think they're really named after? It's the Jewish hope. What irony. Well, we're going to continue forward a little bit because it's absolutely astounding. We're going to go 100 years before Muhammad was born. And this is a dedication stele in Yemen. This is in Sheba, in Arabia. This is a dedication stele. Now, look what it says. We're 523 now. We're 100 years before Muhammad. It's a dedication celebrating the conquest of Najran, a Christian city, by a man called Yusuf of Himyar, a Jew. And this particular inscription is going to show the dedication of their God for gratitude and triumph in this victory of this Christian city. This is what it says. Right at the bottom left, you can see the word, well, you can't read it because it's in Sabaic, but it says Mahmed. This is Hebrews. This is the Hebrew writings in the Sabaic script. And the Hebrews say, by the Lord of the Jews, by the highly praised. So this was a phrase used by the Jews. hundreds of years before Muhammad came upon the scene. And experts assert that the name Muhammad was a title for the Jewish exilarchs. So these are the leaders in the Jewish diaspora. 5 of them have been found, apparently. 5 of these have been found in the 7th century, suggesting that the Christians then adopted this title and applied it to Jesus in the 7th century. In other words, the Jews referred to Muhammad as the Messiah to come, and the Christians used it for the Messiah to return. It's all on a stone. I believe Jesus in Luke 19 verse 40 said that even the stones will cry out my name. Well, let's go to the first proper caliph in the Umayyad period. This is a man called Muawiyah. We're in 664 now, and you'll notice there is an inscription known as the Maronite Chronicle. How does the inscription start? Well, I circled it. There's a cross there. And notice the language is not in Arabic or Aramaic, it's in Greek. Why is a caliph writing in Greek? Because that was the Christian language of the time in Byzantium. He's writing in the Christian tongue. Now, this is the translation of Muawiyah on the Maronite Chronicle that refers to an event in 660. Look what it says. Many Arabs gathered together in Jerusalem and made Muawiyah king, and he went up and sat down at Golgotha. He prayed there and went to Gethsemane and went down to the tomb of Mary to pray in it. And he placed his throne in Damascus and refused to go to the throne of Muhammad. We've got an Islamic caliph going to the sites that support Christianity. And notice what it says at the end. He places his throne in Damascus and he refused to sit in Jerusalem because he referred to that as being the throne of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad in Islamic tradition never claimed ever to have a throne in Jerusalem, but another Muhammad did, the son of David, Jesus. And he's going to Golgotha, brothers and sisters. Why is he going to Golgotha? Because it says in Matthew 27, verse 37, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. This is not Muslim teaching at all. Well, let's move forward a little bit more in time. We're going to look at this king. I say he's a king, he's an emperor. He's known as Justinian II. So we're going to look at Byzantium. Here he is, Justinian II, and you'll notice he's got a coin, and with him on that coin are his 2 sons. One is called Tiberius, and the other one is called Heraclius. And you'll notice they're all holding 3 crosses, Trinitarian crosses. Now, he looks rather mean, doesn't he, Justinian II? He's got a metal nose because it was apparently sliced off. You wouldn't have beef with this man, would you? But this man did, right? al-Malik. He was the caliph serving in the courts of Islam at the same time. So what the story is that Justinian II demanded tribute of al-Malik because Byzantium was the superpower of the day. And so al-Malik acquiesced to his request and he mints a coin. So you can see that's the coin of Byzantium. What's missing, do you think, on al-Malik's coin? What's not there? Or maybe you can't see, but the crosses are missing. He's mocking the Trinity, brothers and sisters. It seems to me that al-Malik understood the spirit of Matthew 22, verse 21. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. And you'll see surrounding the coin is the very first time we see anything Islamic at all. It's called the Shahada. There is only one God, and the praised one is his messenger. It seems to me that he was an anti-Trinitarian asserting the tenet of monotheism against Byzantium. And well, Justinian II is furious with this because this is an attack on Christianity. So what he does, he goes to war in 692 against Abd al-Malik, and the Caliph wins the war. And he mints another coin. This is the victory coin of Abd al-Malik. There's the cross missing. There he is holding the sword. And on it is the Shahada. There is only one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. He is confronting Roman Trinitarianism, and he's saying Muhammad is nothing more than a messenger. That's all he is. He's not God. That's the spirit that's being said on the coin in 692. Well, another third coin was then minted in 696. And you'll notice here, no images. You'll not see one image in Islam post this event. And right at the top, you can see the assault. This is the Shahada we know today. Say not three, for God is one. He is not begotten, and he has no son. You can see now he's accusing them of the idolatrous worship of Jesus. And this Islamic Caliph now is condemning the elevation of Jesus to the status of God. But what we're beginning to notice as we slowly move forward in time is that there is a gradual theological change. What began with the throne of Jesus, now they're denouncing him to be the Son of God. This is a slow change in the regime that became Islam today. And incidentally, this particular caliph, Abd al-Malik, he's the man responsible to build this building, the Dome of the Rock in 691. This is the apparent first ever mosque. So if this is the first ever mosque, we've got to ask a very straightforward question. Why isn't it built in Mecca? Why hasn't anyone asked that question before? Why is this not built in Mecca? If not built in Mecca, why is it not built in Damascus? Why is it built in Jerusalem? Because that's the heart of the Judeo-Christian home. It is the very place where Solomon, the Muhammad, built his home for God. In fact, it wasn't called the Dome of the Rock originally. It was called the Holy House, a reference directly taken from 1 Kings 6-8. Now, if we were to look at the inscriptions of the Dome of the Rock, believe it or not, brothers and sisters, those first inscriptions are there. Do you know the Dome of the Rock has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times? The inscriptions are still there, the first ones. And in that is a declaration of faith in the heart of the Temple Mount. Look what it says. These are the first inscriptions. There is no God but God alone, and the Blessed One is his messenger. Not Muhammad, just the Blessed One. Notice the language now. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God, and his word which he conveyed unto Mary. So believe in God and his messages, and say not three. Cease from saying three. It is better for you to say that God is one God. Far be it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son. We're seeing a man coming into Jerusalem, building this house, not to conquer Jerusalem, but to liberate it from the clutches of Byzantium Trinitarianism. They don't have the truth, brothers and sisters. Of course they don't have the truth. But he's coming in to liberate them. You know, there's nothing about the Miraj. The Miraj. Anyone who's looked at it might know what the Miraj is. It's when Muhammad, the prophet, apparently went on a horse, right? And the horse flew to Jerusalem. He bounced up and down heaven 5 times to receive 5 prayers. And on the way, he saw Moses. Now, you'd think if that was part of the Islamic doctrine, that would be written in the Temple Mount. But it's not there. It's not there. Maybe, brothers and sisters, it hadn't yet been written down. Because that's the story, I think, is being played out. And well, as we come to a conclusion of this point, Islamic tradition explains, right, that Muhammad came in and he burned down and destroyed all the pagan religions. But history doesn't tell us this. History is telling us that right in Arabia, there were many Christians and Jews. It was filled with Christianity. Christianity had gone to the ends of the earth. Brothers and sisters, Britain was Christian in this time. We're talking about the 7th century. The Anglo-Saxons were building churches during the 7th century. And during this time, the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids were Christian Arabs. You know, there are just four non-Muslim references that speak about a man called Muhammad. Just 4 of them, non-Muslim references. All of them are either in Gaza, Israel, or Damascus. One reference of a man called Muhammad or Muhammad happens to appear on a flyleaf of an open Bible. Then another reference is by this bishop, Bishop Sebeos in the 7th century. He refers to a figure called Muhammad advocating the Jewish rights to Israel. Very un-Islamic today. Something isn't right, brothers and sisters. The research is providing us with some big questions about the Muhammad we've got to know, and also puts into doubt the credibility and the authenticity of the standard Islamic narrative. So what does Revelation 9 tell us in the reading we've just had? Let's turn to Revelation 9, please. With all the mire that we've gone through, that there is one thing we know that is the truth. One thing we can absolutely be crystal about, and that is the rise of Islam was a theological rise. It was mutiny against the dogma and the teachings of Byzantium Christianity. That's what they rose up against. The rest of the story, well, frankly, I don't think this will ever know really what was going on. But the truth is the mutiny of Rome. And this reinforces everything we know about Bible prophecy. So let's go to Revelation chapter 9. This is the 5th trumpet. This is the first woe trumpet on Eastern Rome. And you'll notice in verse 1 immediately says, a star was to fall from heaven. The heavens that we see there in verse 1 is, of course, speaking of the Roman political heavens. Now, the prophet Muhammad in Islamic tradition was never ever part of the Roman political heavens. He was a tribal orphan, grew up with his uncle. But the emblem of him would be a symbol that's going to stir up a revolt that will be crystallized in the caliphs. Notice the star in verse 1 is always figurative, isn't it, of a king or a ruler. It's used in Isaiah 14 verse 2 to denote the king of Babylon as a star. It's used in the previous chapter in Revelation 8 verse 10 to describe Attila and the Huns in their judgment on the west. It's the language of a king and a ruler. And if you just know, brothers and sisters, the language of the star you see in verse 1 and 2 just so happens to be the same language of the king we see in verse 11. And the angel now is announcing him with rising power. Revelation 9 doesn't talk about a man in a cave proclaiming a new theology. Revelation 9 goes right into the heart of the matter. It is a rebellion against the Nicene Creed 300 years previously, under the banner, that would be monotheism, led by an Arabian caliph under the insignia of Mahmed in this time period. Now, I think this brings us to a very interesting point to consider. If the Islamic narrative isn't the truth, and Muhammad isn't the one of the standard Islamic narrative, then, brothers and sisters, he can't be a man. And if he's not a man, then he can't be a prophet. If he's not a prophet, then he can't be the false prophet. Because the false prophet doesn't sit in his seat of power in Mecca. The false prophet has sat where he's always been sitting. He's in Rome. The man of perdition, the man of sin has already been revealed. The bishop is already there in Rome, and here they are rising against the apostasy. They're rising against the man of sin. They want to rule. If you note there in verse 1 that the star was given the key of the bottomless pit. So I'm going to put on the screen there. I'm going to put on the screen what it actually should say. The bottomless pit can be a little bit misleading. It should say the shaft or the well of the abyss. This is what it means. The shaft, the pit, the well of the abyss. So here we've got a well that leads to this abyss. Well, what's the abyss? The abyss is the sea of humanity. Revelation 11 tells us that the abyss is the Roman population. In fact, Revelation 17 explains to us that the papal beast was to rise from the abyss. This is the apostasy. They want to get to the Roman Christian world, dominance of the seabed of Europe, and they want to dominate the abyss. So they've got the key that opens up the shaft, the Arabian Peninsula, one of the lowest points on planet Earth, and that Arabian tunnel is going to give them access to Christian Europe. If you look at verse 2, out of the shaft, smoke and a furnace billowed from within. This is smoke and fire. Incidentally, by the way, that phrase, smoke and furnace, you see in verse 2, can be traced back to Genesis 19, verse 28, in which we have there the language of God's wrath and indignation against Sodom and Gomorrah. This is rising up against Sodom and Gomorrah, now manifested in Rome. They want to destroy Rome. And well, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by God, wasn't it? In other words, this is God's anger. This is God's wrath. This is God's indignation displayed and manifested through an Arabian political mutiny rising in from the east. And in that, brothers and sisters, verse 2, the Roman world now is going to darken. And in its darkness came forth locusts. The word locust there you see in verse 3. If you pick up a lexicon, just a Greek word akris, and the lexicon's rather helpful because it tells us that this is a specific species of locust. In fact, it goes on to say that this particular species of locust, the akris, is carried from the winds of Arabia. This is an Arabian locust rising from the east out of the smoke. In fact, the Hebrew word for locust is the word arba. The word Arab in Hebrew is the word arbi, and the word desert is the word araba. You know, if you were unfortunate enough to be a Hebrew linguist who's dyslexic, Every time you read the word Arab, you'd read the word locust. Every time you read the locust, you read the word desert. And every time you read the word desert, you read the word locust and Arab. You know, they're all pointing to the same symbol. And there's two phases to a locust, isn't there? They're solitary, and then all of a sudden, they just swarm. These Arabians have been solitary for quite some time, and now they have a means to devour and to destroy in their swarms. And Joel 1 verse 4 gives us the metaphor of a swarming locust. He describes them as becoming a great army. We don't have locusts in this country. We're rather fortunate. But they have a voracious appetite, don't they? They destroy. In fact, that's what they're good at. Destruction. Hence why the king in verse 11, who's the caliph, is known as Apollyon, which means the destroyer. And it's fascinating that if we were to look into Proverbs 30 and verse 27, we're told explicitly there that the locusts have no king. And yet here, in the first time in Arabian history, they unite with an Arabian king called the caliph in their hatred to Roman Christianity. That was the catalyst, brothers and sisters. That was the trigger point. Now, we know that locusts are rather good at migration. This is the map of a migrating swarm of locusts. You'll notice on the screen they travel from North Africa and they go as far west to the right to the border of Spain. And that's as far as they will go to the border of Spain. And you might not be surprised that the very natural migration of a locust reflects perfectly the Arab expansion in the 7th century. They traveled as far as the locust. In fact, if you were to look at verse 7 of Revelation 9, the shapes of the locusts are like horses. So even verse 7 describes them being like horses. And they came in as cavalry. That's what's being told. Cavalry of horses. And incidentally, the word cavalry comes from the Italian root cavaletta. And the word cavaletta in Italian is a word to use for a little horse. And that's the same word they use for locusts. Jumping horses, little horses. And that's how they came in under the caliph, the language of the locust. Notice what it says in verse 4. And I think this is the point, that they were not to hurt those with God's seal. Why wouldn't they hurt people with God's seal? Who were these type of people? These were monotheists. These were those who believed in one God. Christians who believed in one God, and Jews who believed in one God. And there in verse 4, we're told that they didn't hurt those who went against Roman Christianity. You know, you have to go to Revelation 11 and Revelation 12. We've got what would become the Protestant church fleeing across the whole extremities of Rome. There were many people who opposed Christianity or Roman Christianity at that point. Now, we're right at the point now of quite a significant date in history. Notice on the screen, the locust has gone as far as it can travel, and we're now in 732. 732 leads us to the Battle of Tours. And at the Battle of Tours, we've got the Arabians under the caliph called Abdul al-Rahman. And he's leading the Arabians, the Saracens, into Gaul, which is now called France. And this is a momentous point in history, because if the Arabians could conquer France, they've taken Europe. And by taking Europe, they've taken the abyss. But the caliph was stopped. He was stopped by a man called Charles Martel, who goes by the name of Charles the Hammer. He led the Franks against the Arabians. Charles the Hammer happens to have a very, very famous grandson. This is Charlemagne's grandfather. And Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles the Hammer, has the last stand against the Arabians before they're swarmed over by locusts. And it was a momentous battle because it was the first time, or one of the first times in recorded history, where infantry beat horses, cavalry. In other words, Charles the Hammer won. In what was a most surprising victory, he stopped the locust, and they stopped in the border of Spain, just like their natural migration. And what's particularly fascinating is that right at the time where Charles the Hammer won, we start seeing these inscriptions on stones with words. We see the words Muslim appear, and we see the words Islam appear, right at the time of their loss against Charles the Hammer from 730 onwards. An identity now is being formulated in their lack of conquering the abyss. Not long after this moment, there was insurrection in the Umayyad period that saw the rise of a new dynasty called the Abbasid period. Another 50 years later was the most significant moment, because in 800 AD, Charlemagne, the grandson of Charles Martel, well, he was crowned the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And what a coincidence, brothers and sisters, that not long after this, we start to see an introduction of a man, a prophet, reams and reams of literature about the man we know to be Muhammad. Isn't it interesting that it implies, I think, to me, and to many others, that the beast of the earth, the Holy Roman Empire, the seeds of Europe, is responsible for shaping Islam as we know it today. And from the data we've inspected, failure to take Europe gave the Arabians exactly what they needed. A blank sheet of paper where they could put their new identity beyond the pages of history. A new religion that repurposed Judeo-Christian traditions. After all, it was the Jews who had corrupted the Old Testament, and it was the Christians who had corrupted the New Testament. It was the Jews who refused Jesus, and it was the Christians who removed God entirely. They have the final revelation now. And the book became the Quran. The prophet was called Muhammad. The God was called Allah. The religion was called Islam. The people were known as Muslims, and their lineage was from Ishmael. And they're not ruling in Mecca at this point. It's still a desert. They're ruling in Baghdad in the Fertile Crescent. And it was very strategic because in Baghdad, there was a huge library called the House of Wisdom, and teachers known as imams were sent across the four corners of the Arabian Empire to teach and school the population of this religion. And the empire became Islamic, and Muhammad, the prophet, became its emblem. He was the memorial, brothers and sisters. Muhammad, whose roots go to Mahmed, Islam means submission to God, to combat what they thought was an apostate system, and they were absolutely right. The Holy Roman Empire, whose sole ideology is to submit to the papal yoke. In other words, long story short, I think it's pointing that it was the dragon power of Constantinople that gave birth to the Arabian revolt under the Umayyad period. And it was the Holy Roman Empire that crowned them Islam under the Abbasids. Two theological powers opposing one another, all rooted into the same cause. As the old saying goes, all roads lead to Rome. And I think God is declaring a very profound message. Don't tamper with my son. Make him divine and part of a Godhead Trinity and remove accountability. Then you become like this. But if you remove his sacrifice and his work of atonement, then you become utterly unforgiving, like this. There, brothers and sisters, is the tension. And little did any of the population of this world know that the conflict and the tension between these two ideologies is predicated on what we now know to be the atonement. It's God manifestation. Everything is about Jesus. It's all centered on him. And if we look deep into the mystery and the mire of Islam, it's not what we find, it's who we find. Jesus is the hidden story of Islam's untold origin. And why wouldn't it be? This is God's Son. Well, after establishing territory, those locusts eventually settled, didn't they? You'll notice there that they start to settle in around 782 by the caliph known as Harun al-Rashid. And Harun al-Rashid created peace between Charlemagne and Constantinople, peace after 150 years of wars of Byzantium, peace after 150 years. And 150 years just happens to be 150 prophetic days, and 150 prophetic days just happens to be a period of 5 months, and 5 months just happens to be the breeding activity of a locust between May and September. And how many months were those locusts active for in verse 5? Well, 5 months. There is the symbol. And well, just to note, another 5 months there in verse 10. That's another 150 years. So we're now in the 10th century in verse 10. And in the 10th century, the Abbasids declined. God stopped the locust. And why would he do this? Why would God stop the locusts? Why would he stop the regime of the Arabians? Because a number of things had to happen. The Arabians had to become the Islamic Empire. Holy Roman Empire had to become Europe. Eastern Rome and Western Rome had to split, and Byzantium had to be weakened. And I think we'll just finish off to lead into Brother Roger's thoughts. The end of Byzantium, the second woe trumpet of Revelation 9 verse 14. Revelation 9 verse 14. This is the second woe trumpet. And you'll notice now we're in the river Euphrates. And the river Euphrates, of course, is going to be the symbol of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. We're now on the 29th of May, 1453.
And the Ottomans are right outside Constantinople, the great walls of that headquarters. And, well, we've got a warlord now leading the Islam party to the heart of Christianity. Anyone know what the warlord, the king was called who led the Ottomans? Fascinating. His name was Mehmed II. How that name has come back to haunt Byzantium. And he takes Constantinople. He does the unthinkable. He breaks down the impregnable. He does the imaginable. And Constantinople fell to the Ottoman. And there in 1453, on the 29th of May, was the last stand of Rome. And verse 16 to verse 21 lays down the conquering of Constantinople. Well, of course, they didn't completely destroy the people, did they? You can't destroy an ideology, can you? You can destroy a city, but you can't break a mentality. And the philosophy and the religion of Constantinople remained. It just moved. We know where it moved to. It moved to a territory that we now know to be Kievan Rus. That's where it moved to. Orthodoxy just moved house and went to Kievan Rus. And there was a city there that became the headquarters of Orthodoxy in Kievan Rus, that became the guardian of Roman Eastern Christianity. And I think you know what that city's called, don't you? It's Moscow. Moscow became the headquarters of Byzantium. All Moscow is today, brothers and sisters, is Rome. It's Eastern Rome. It's dormant Rome. But it's there in the cold territory of Russia. In the meantime, the Ottoman Empire waxed great. And like Revelation 9 verse 14 says, it followed the river Euphrates, because the river Euphrates became the symbol of the Ottoman Empire. Now, where Revelation stops, Daniel 11 provides, because there's a key territory here in the Mesopotamian area, in the Fertile Crescent. It's actually been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's just been passed down from nation to nation, from power to power. And now it's found itself, surprisingly, in the hands of the Ottomans. It's a title. It's there in Daniel 11. We know the title. We're rather familiar with it. It's called the territory of the King of the North. The King of the North is Syria, Iran, and Iraq. It's the ancient Seleucus territory that goes back to ancient Greece. And well, now the Ottoman has found himself as the King of the North, and Islam has been the King of the North for quite some time. But what we do know is that that river Euphrates is going to dry up. In fact, it tells us in Revelation 16, verse 12, that the river Euphrates will dry up. And if the river Euphrates is drying up, then the Ottoman Empire is to dry up, because they're both synonymous with one another. They're the symbols of each other. And well, here we are now in 2024. Would you agree that the Ottoman Empire is nearly dried up, because only the Turkish Empire or the Turkish power is still existent today? I think the name gives it away, the Ottoman Turks. And Turkey is the last stand. I mean, it was a river, brothers and sisters. We're now just in a little stream now, aren't we? The great stream of the river Euphrates is the King of the North. But Daniel 11 continues to say that a new King of the North is yet to come. A new King of the North is going to rule over Iran, Syria, and Iraq. So we'll ask and assert the question here, Which power today do you think has the most influence in the areas of Syria, Iran, and Iraq, which just so happens to be the territory of the King of the North, which just so happens to be the very area of the drying Euphrates? Which power is it? Well, it shouldn't come any surprise. It's Russia. Russia has marvelous relation. Who'd want to go and ally themselves with Syria? Russia does. This is a theological war. He wants to rebuild Byzantium in the east. Today it's Russia, and there are the Muslim Islamic countries who are all Shia Muslims, and they just happen to be pro-Russian and anti-Israel. But the Daniel 11 prophecy continues. Not only are we going to see a new king of the north come down, but he's going to come down like a whirlwind into Constantinople. So I'll ask another question. Which country would like to be in Constantinople? Which nation today has its heritage and its legacy and its roots back in Eastern Rome at Byzantium? I'll ask an even a more poignant question. Which nation wants to reclaim Constantinople? Byzantium is Russia and Russia is Byzantium. And we're going to see a power come from the heart of Moscow, confederate with Iran, Iraq, and Syria to become the king of the north of Daniel 11. And then once he becomes the king of the north, he conquers Constantinople. Daniel 8 tells us we're going to see the unveiling of a king standing. And Ezekiel 38 gives us the name of that king. He calls him Gog, the prince of Rosh, of the land of Magog. Magog today is where? Kievian Rus. And Ezekiel 38 tells us he's going to come from the extremities of the north. I think it's rather safe and logical and wise to strongly suggest that that king in Daniel 8 is a Russian Tsar, rising up from the ashes of Byzantium. And Daniel 8 continues and says that through policy, he shall cause craft to prosper. He'll magnify himself, and by peace he shall destroy many. We're going to see a head of state forging a geopolitical alliance, and Byzantium is poised to regain strength in the east. In other words, if Byzantium birthed the Islamic revolt, he's going to end up controlling it. Islam has always been the plague upon Rome, and he's going to somehow maneuver himself into a position where Ezekiel 38 and verse 7 says he's going to guard them. And as for the abyss, Western Europe, well, there the frog-like spirits croak and breed. And they're going to unite those enemies together against a common people, a group of people who incidentally reject Muhammad and also reject Jesus. The Jews, brothers and sisters. And they occupy a land that Byzantium and Islam feel they can lay claim on from historic and religious grounds. You know, the Romans gave them a name. Do you know that? In the 1st and 2nd centuries, it was a name that was coined by Byzantium, but it was preserved by Islam throughout the centuries. It was a name that they used to dissociate the Jews from their land. It's the name Palestinia. What better way to call and dissociate the Jews from their homeland by calling them Philistines? That was the Roman name preserved by Islam. And I think we're going to see a reversal of Islam's origins. Islam began with a holy campaign to liberate Jerusalem from the clutches of Byzantium, but at the end it's a coalition with Byzantium in a religious war to conquer Jerusalem, and this time the illegitimate occupants, the impostors, are the Jews. But one state will not. One state, one Muslim state will not follow their brethren. Anyone know who those states are? Well, Ezekiel 38 tells us. Sheba and Edom. Arabia, brothers and sisters. And we've gone full circle. Arabia began its revolt against Byzantium, and it will end with its friendship for Israel against Byzantium again. What marvelous symmetry, brothers and sisters. When there is a divide today between the Shia and the Sunni, and I don't know if you saw Netanyahu's UN speech yesterday. I couldn't believe it. I thought, brilliant, that's my end slide. There he is, between Shia and Sunni, Muhammad and Mahmed, because it's going to be the Sunni who have their solidarity for Israel. And I think it goes way before the 7th century. This goes back, brothers and sisters, to Genesis chapter 25, where we see two brothers burying their father at Machpelah. One was to follow the godly seed that led to Jesus, called Isaac, and the other one was Ishmael, who came to Arabia, it says in Genesis 25, who moved to Paran. And the last time you see those two brothers together are at the funeral of their father. And how wonderful that they're going to be reunited at his resurrection. Abraham the father, uniting the Arabians with their brothers the Jews, one of Ishmael and one of Isaac. There Jesus will stand, the son of Isaac, to save Jerusalem, and the remnant of the Hebrews and the Muslims, once opposed by the promises, shall embrace with the promised son. For behold, brothers and sisters, the greater than Solomon is here. The king they disowned in many different ways. The lovely one.